Why childhood trauma is the root cause of most addictions, all right. Let's dive into something that, at first glance, might seem simple, but the deeper we go, the more complex and profound it becomes. Why is childhood trauma the root cause of most addictions? Now, I know this is a heavy topic, but stick with me because what we're about to unpack could change the way you view not only addiction but life itself. First, let's start with the question, what is addiction really? I'm not talking about the surface definition, like the compulsive need to consume substances or engage in behaviors. No, I'm asking something deeper. Why do people get addicted in the first place? Why does someone turn to alcohol, drugs, food, gambling, or even social media as an escape? What are they really escaping from? Here's where we hit the core of the issue. Addiction isn't about the substance or the behavior. It's about the pain that lies underneath. And more often than not, that pain has its roots in unhealed childhood trauma. Trauma, especially from our formative years, leaves a kind of emotional wound that, if left untreated, festers over time. And when you're dealing with unresolved pain, you'll do anything to numb it, even if that means turning to substances or behaviors that eventually control you. But let's ask the deeper question, what exactly is trauma? Trauma isn't just about the things that happened to you. It's also about the things that didn't happen, the love you didn't receive, the safety you didn't feel, the validation that was missing. Trauma is about the gap between what you needed as a child and what you actually experienced. And that gap, it leaves a void. A void that, as adults, we often try to fill with anything that dulls the pain, distracts us, or makes us feel temporarily whole. Now, think about it. Why is childhood trauma so powerful? Why does something that happened years ago still affect us so deeply? It's because childhood is the time when we're most vulnerable, most impressionable. Our brains are still developing, and so are our emotional frameworks. The experiences we have during this time shape not only how we see the world, but how we see ourselves. If a child grows up feeling unsafe, unloved, or unseen, those feelings don't just disappear with age. They become the lens through which that person views the entire world. And if that lens is tainted by trauma, it distorts everything, including how we handle pain and cope with it. But here's where it gets profound. Addiction isn't just about escaping pain, it's also about trying to reclaim control. When someone grows up in an environment where they feel powerless, whether due to abuse, neglect, or emotional abandonment, they often turn to addictive behaviors as a way to regain a sense of control, however fleeting it may be. That drink, that drug, that dopamine hit it off as a temporary illusion of control over their emotional state. But it's a vicious cycle. The more control you seek through addiction, the more control you actually lose.
Click subscribe to this channel to get more profound spiritual lesson.
Let's pause here and ask ourselves a really deep question. How much of our adult behavior is a reaction to wounds we never healed from childhood? Think about it. How many of our choices, our habits, good or bad, are influenced by things we haven't even consciously dealt with? It's easy to judge someone with an addiction from the outside, but what if we looked at addiction as a survival mechanism? What if, instead of seeing addiction as a moral failing, we saw it as the body and mind's desperate attempt to cope with overwhelming pain? This brings us to a critical point. Addiction isn't the problem, it's the symptom. The real problem is the trauma underneath, the emotional wounds that were never healed. And until we address those wounds, no amount of willpower, rehab, or self-discipline will truly fix the addiction. Because addiction is just the surface. What lies beneath is the real battle. But here's the paradox. Addiction, in many ways, is a search for connection. A connection to something that makes us feel alive, something that fills that inner void. But the tragedy is that addiction disconnects us even more from ourselves, from others, from life. The very thing we're seeking, connection, wholeness, peace, is what addiction ultimately robs us of. So, if you or someone you know is struggling with addiction, the question to ask isn't, how do we stop the addiction? But rather, what pain are we trying to escape from? What wound are we trying to numb? Because when we heal the trauma underneath, the need for the addiction often dissolves on its own. The invisible chains of childhood trauma. Let's take this a step further. We've established that addiction is a symptom, not the root cause. But now, let's fully explore how childhood trauma creates invisible chains that bind us to addictive behaviors and patterns. These chains are often so deeply embedded in our psyche that we don't even realize they're there until we start unraveling the layers of our past. So how does trauma manifest in a way that leads to addiction? To understand this, we need to grasp a fundamental truth about human beings: we are wired for connection. As children, we are entirely dependent on the adults in our lives for survival, not just physically but emotionally. We need love, safety, validation, and a sense of belonging. When these needs aren't met, whether through neglect, abuse, or even subtle emotional invalidation, it leaves a scar. But trauma isn't just a one-time event. It's often cumulative. It builds up over time, especially in childhood when we're so vulnerable. Imagine a child who consistently feels ignored or unloved. Over time, that child develops a belief: I am not worthy of love. I am not enough. That belief becomes a core part of their identity, shaping how they interact with the world and, more importantly, how they interact with themselves. Now, here's where it gets profound. Addiction often begins as an attempt to cope with this fractured sense of self. When you carry the belief that you're unworthy, that something is fundamentally wrong with you, the pain can be unbearable. And what do we do with unbearable pain? We look for ways to numb it, to escape it, to momentarily forget it exists. That's where substances, behaviors, or toxic relationships come in. They offer a temporary reprieve, a momentary sense of relief or control over an otherwise chaotic inner world. But let's go deeper. Why is trauma so difficult to heal from? Why do so many people turn to addiction instead of addressing the pain at its source? The answer lies in the nature of trauma itself. Trauma fractures your sense of self. It splits you into parts: the part of you that experienced the trauma and the part of you that tries to survive it. This split creates a disconnect within yourself, making it hard to feel whole. And here's the kicker: addiction thrives in disconnection. The more disconnected you feel from yourself, the more likely you are to seek external sources of comfort or control. Ask yourself this: how often do we try to fix internal wounds with external solutions? It's like trying to fill a bottomless pit. No matter how much you consume, whether it's drugs, alcohol, food, or even attention, it never feels like enough. Why? Because the real issue isn't external, it's internal. The pain is inside, and no amount of external gratification can truly heal what's broken on the inside. This brings us to a critical insight: addiction is often an unconscious attempt to reclaim a sense of wholeness. When we feel fractured, when we're carrying the burden of unresolved trauma, we instinctively search for something to fill that void. Addiction offers a fleeting sense of completeness, a temporary escape from the fragmented self. But it's a false sense of wholeness, one that quickly fades and leaves us more disconnected than before. Think about it: why do so many people with addictions describe feeling empty inside? It's because they're not just battling a craving for a substance, they're battling a craving for connection, for meaning, for a sense of who they are beyond the pain. Addiction, in this sense, becomes a misguided attempt to reconnect with the lost parts of ourselves. But here's the paradox: the very thing we use to escape our pain addiction ends up deepening it. The more we rely on external substances or behaviors to numb the pain, the more we reinforce the belief that we're not capable of handling our emotions, of facing our trauma. We become trapped in a cycle of avoidance, constantly running from the very thing we need to confront in order to heal. Let me ask you a deep question: what would happen if, instead of running from our pain, we faced it head-on? What if we stopped using addiction as a way to avoid the difficult emotions and memories tied to our trauma? It would be terrifying, yes, but it would also be the first step toward true healing. Because here's the truth: you can't heal what you refuse to feel. This is why addiction is so pervasive for those who've experienced childhood trauma. It's not just about the substance or the behavior, it's about the emotions that are too painful to process, the memories that are too overwhelming to face. Addiction becomes a coping mechanism, a way to survive in a world that feels too unsafe, too painful, too unpredictable. But here's the good news: healing is possible. It's not easy, and it's not quick, but it's possible. And it starts with acknowledging the trauma, with recognizing that the addiction is a symptom, not the problem itself. When you start to address the root cause, the unresolved pain, the unhealed wounds, you begin to break free from the invisible chains of trauma. You start to reclaim your sense of self, your sense of wholeness, without needing external substances or behaviors to do it for you. Healing the wounds beneath the addiction. So, we've established that addiction is a symptom of deeper, unresolved pain, primarily childhood trauma. But now we need to ask the most important question: how do we begin to heal those wounds? How do we move from a place of pain, disconnection, and numbing to a place of healing, integration, and wholeness? This is where the real journey begins. First, we need to recognize that healing is not about fixing ourselves. It's about understanding ourselves. Trauma makes us feel like something is wrong with us, like we're broken. But the truth is, we're not broken, we've just been wounded. And there's a big difference between being wounded and being broken. A wound can heal, but only if we acknowledge it and treat it with care. The problem is, so many of us have been conditioned to push our wounds aside, to pretend they don't exist, or worse, to feel ashamed of them. This is where self-compassion comes into play. Healing begins with compassion, not just for others, but for yourself. You need to recognize that your addiction, your pain, your trauma, they are not signs of weakness. They are signs that you've been carrying something incredibly heavy, something that no child should have had to bear. And that's where we start, by giving ourselves permission to feel the pain we've been avoiding. But here's the thing: healing isn't a linear process. It's messy. Some days you'll feel like you're making progress, other days it'll feel like you're right back where you started. And that's okay. The key is to keep going, to keep showing up for yourself, even when it's hard. Because healing isn't about reaching a destination, it's about learning to live with and through your pain in a way that no longer controls you. Now, let's talk about the crucial role of awareness in healing. You can't heal what you're not aware of. For many people, addiction is a way to avoid the awareness of their trauma. It's easier to numb the pain than to face it. But the first step toward healing is to bring that pain into the light, to become aware of the patterns, the triggers, the emotional wounds that are driving the addiction. This awareness is uncomfortable, yes, but it's also empowering. Because once you're aware, once you can see the root of the problem, you can start to address it. Ask yourself, what are you really seeking when you reach for that substance or engage in that addictive behavior? What need is going unmet? Is it a need for love, for safety, for validation? Once you identify the unmet need, you can begin to meet it in healthier, more constructive ways. This is where therapy, support groups, and mindfulness practices can be incredibly helpful. They provide a safe space to explore your pain, to process your trauma, and to learn new ways of coping that don't involve numbing or escaping. But here's the profound truth: healing isn't about getting rid of your trauma. It's about learning to live with it in a way that no longer defines you or your choices. Trauma may never fully disappear, but its grip on your life can loosen. The goal isn't to erase the past, but to integrate it, to make peace with it, to understand how it shaped you, and to find a way to move forward without being shackled by it. And this brings us to a pivotal realization: healing is an act of reclaiming your power. Trauma and addiction take away your sense of control, your sense of agency. They make you feel like you're at the mercy of forces beyond your control. But as you heal, as you confront the pain beneath the addiction, you start to reclaim your power. You realize that you are not helpless. You are not defined by what happened to you. You are capable of healing, of growing, of becoming whole again. Reclaiming your life beyond the addiction. Now, let's talk about what it means to truly reclaim your life beyond addiction. Because healing from childhood trauma and breaking free from addiction isn't just about surviving, it's about thriving. It's about rediscovering who you are without the weight of your trauma constantly pulling you down. It's about building a life that isn't defined by the past, but by the choices you make in the present. Here's the profound yet simple truth: you are not your trauma. You are not your addiction. They may have shaped you, they may have influenced your thoughts, behaviors, and beliefs for years, but they do not define the core of who you are. That core, your true self, has always been there, underneath the layers of pain, hurt, and coping mechanisms. Healing is about reconnecting with that self, the part of you that is whole, resilient, and worthy of love and fulfillment. But how do you get there? It starts by taking back your narrative. Trauma often leaves us feeling like victims of our circumstances, powerless to change our future. But the power to reclaim your life comes when you realize that your story is still being written. The things that happen to you are just chapters, they are not the whole book. You have the power to write the next chapter, to decide how you want to live, who you want to live, who you want to be, and what kind of life you want to create. Deep down, ask yourself, what kind of life do you want to live beyond addiction? What dreams, passions, or desires have been buried beneath the pain? What relationships would you like to repair, or what new connections would you like to nurture? Recovery isn't just about removing something, the addiction, it's about building something new in its place, something meaningful, authentic, and aligned with who you truly are. As you heal, you'll find that the things you once used to cope, the substances, the behaviors, start to lose their grip. They no longer serve the same purpose because you're learning to meet your needs in healthier, more constructive ways. You're reclaiming your sense of control, your agency, and your ability to choose how you respond to life's challenges. And here's the most powerful truth of all: healing is an ongoing process. It's not a destination you reach, but a journey you walk, day by day. There will be setbacks, there will be moments of doubt, but each day that you choose healing over numbing, connection over isolation, and self-compassion over self-judgment, you're reclaiming a little more of your life. In the end, reclaiming your life beyond addiction isn't just about breaking free from the chains of the past, it's about embracing the future with hope, resilience, and a deep sense of your own worth. You deserve that. You always have.